Hi, we're continuing our read of Volume 6. And today we're reading Twilight at the Towers. I do not remember this one, so brand new to me. The photographs of Mironenko, which Ballard had been shown in Munich, had proved far from instructive. Only one or two pictured the KGB man full face, and of the others, most were blurred and grainy, betraying their furtive origins. Ballard was not overmuch concerned. He knew from long and occasionally bitter experience that the eye was all too ready to be deceived, but there were other faculties, the remnants of senses modern life had rendered obsolete, which he had learned to call into play, enabling him to sniff out the least signs of betrayal. These were the talents he would use when he met with Mironenko. With them, he would root the truth from the man. The truth? Therein lay the conundrum, of course, for this context wasn't sincerity a movable feast. Sergei Sererovich Mironenko had been a section leader of Directorate S of the KGB for 11 years, with access to the most privileged information on the dispersal of Soviet illegals in the West. In the recent weeks, however, he had made his disenchantment with his present masters and his consequent desire to defect known to the British Security Service. In return for the elaborate efforts which would have been made on his behalf, he had volunteered to act as an agent within the KGB for a period of 3 months, after which he would be taken into the bosom of democracy and hidden where his vengeful overlords would never find him. It had fallen to Ballard to meet the Russian face to face in the hope of establishing whether Mironenko's disaffection from his ideology was real or faked. The answer would not be found on Mironenko's lips, Ballard knew, but in some behavioral nuance which only instinct would comprehend. Time was when Ballard would have found the puzzle fascinating, that his every waking thought would have circled on the unraveling ahead. But such commitment had belonged to a man convinced his actions had some significant effect upon the world. He was wiser now. The agents of East and West went about their secret works year in, year out. They plotted, they connived. Occasionally, though rarely, they shed blood. There were debacles and trade-offs, minor tactical victories, but in the end, things were much the same as ever. This city, for instance, Ballard had first come to Berlin in April of 1969. He had been 29, fresh from years of intensive training, and ready to live a little. But he had not felt easy here. He found the city charmless, soft, and bleak. It had taken Odell, his colleague, for those first 2 years to prove that Berlin was worthy of his affections, and once Ballard fell, he was lost for life. Now he felt more at home in this divided city than he had ever had in London. Its unease, its failed idealism, and, perhaps most acutely of all, its terrible isolation matched his. He and it maintaining a presence in a wasteland of dead ambition. He found Mironenko at the Grimaldi Gallery, and yes, the photographs had lied. The Russian looked older than his 46 years and sicker than he'd appeared in those filched portraits. Neither man made any sign of acknowledgement. They idled through the collection for a full half hour, with Mironenko showing acute and apparently genuine interest in the work on view. Only when both men were satisfied that they were not being watched did the Russian quit the building and lead Ballard into the polite suburbs of Dahlem to a mutually agreed safe house. There, in a small and unheated kitchen, they sat down and talked. Mironenko's command of English was uncertain, or at least appeared so, though Ballard had the impression that his struggles for sense were as much tactical as grammatical. He might well have presented the same facade in the Russian situation. It seldom hurt to appear less competent than what he was. But despite the difficulties he had in expressing himself, Mironenko's avowals were unequivocal. I am no longer a communist, he stated plainly. I have not been a party member, not here, he put his fist to his chest, for many years. He fetched an off-white handkerchief from his coat pocket, pulled off one of his gloves, and plucked a bottle of tablets from the folds of the handkerchief. Forgive me, he said as he shook tablets from the bottle. I have pains in my head, in my hands. Ballard waited until he had swallowed the medication before asking him, why did you begin to doubt? The Russian pocketed the bottle and the handkerchief, his wide face devoid of expression. How does a man lose his faith, he said. Is that what I saw? Too much or too little, perhaps? He looked at Ballard's face to see if his hesitant words had made sense. Finding no comprehension there, he tried again. I think the man who does not believe he is lost is lost. The paradox was elegantly put. Ballard's suspicion as to Mironenko's true command of English was confirmed. Are you lost now? Ballard inquired. Mironenko didn't reply. He was pulling his other glove off and staring at his hands. The pills he had swallowed did not seem to be easing the ache he had complained of. He fisted and unfisted his hands like an arthritis sufferer, testing the advance of his condition. Not looking up, he said, "I was taught that the party had solutions to everything. That made me free from fear. And now? Now," he said. "Now I have strange thoughts. They come to me from nowhere." "Go on," said Ballard. Mironenko made a tight smile. "You must know me inside out, yes? Even what I dream?" "Yes," said Ballard. Mironenko nodded. "It would be the same with us," he said. Then, after a pause, "I've thought sometimes I would break open. Do you understand what I say? I would crack because there's such rage inside me. And that makes me afraid, Ballard. I think they will see how much I hate them." He looked up at his interrogator. "You must be quick," he said, "or they will discover me. I try not to think of what they will do." Again, he paused. All the trace of the smile, however humorless, had gone. "The directorate has sections even I don't have knowledge of. Special hospitals where nobody can go. They have ways to break a man's soul to pieces." Ballard, ever the pragmatist, wondered if Mironenko's vocabulary wasn't rather high-flown. In the hands of the KGB, he doubted if he would be thinking of his soul's contentment. After all, it was the body that had the nerve endings. They talked for an hour or more, the conversation moving back and forth between politics and personal reminiscence, between trivia and confessional. At the end of the meeting, Ballard was in no doubt as to Mironenko's antipathy to his masters. He was, as he said, a man without faith. The following day, Ballard met with Cripps in the restaurant at the Speiserhof Hotel and made his verbal report on Mironenko. "He's ready and waiting, but he insists we be quick about making up our minds." "I'm sure he does," Cripps said. His glass eye was troubling him today. The chilly air, he explained, made it sluggish. It moved fractionally more slowly than his real eye, and on occasion, Cripps had to nudge it with his fingertip to get it moving. "We're not going to be rushing to any decision," Cripps said. "Where's the problem? I don't have any doubt about his commitment or his desperation." "So you said," Cripps replied. "Would you like something for dessert?" "Do you doubt my appraisal? Is that what this is?" "It has something sweet to finish off, so I don't feel an utter reprobate." "You think I'm wrong about him, don't you?" Ballard pressed. When Cripps didn't reply, Ballard leaned across the table. "You do, don't you?" "I'm just saying there's reason for caution," Cripps said. "If we finally choose to take him on board, the Russians are going to be very distressed. We have to be sure the deal's worth the bad weather that comes with it. Things are so dicey at the moment." "When aren't they?" Ballard replied. "Tell me a time when there wasn't some crisis in the offing." He settled back in the chair and tried to read Cripps' face. His glass eye was, if anything, more candid than the real one. "I'm sick of this damn game," Ballard muttered. The glass eye roved. "Because of the Russian?" "Maybe. Believe me," said Cripps, "I've got good reason to be careful with this man." "Name one." "Nothing's verified." "What have you got on him?" Ballard insisted. "As I say, rumor," Cripps replied. "Why wasn't I briefed about it?" Cripps made a tiny shake of his head. "It's academic now," he said. "You've provided a good report. I just want you to understand that if things don't go the way you think they should, it's not because your appraisals aren't trusted." "I see." "No, you don't," said Cripps. "You're feeling martyred, and I don't altogether blame you." "So what happens now? I'm supposed to forget I ever met the man?" "Wouldn't do any harm," said Cripps. "Out of sight, out of mind." Clearly, Cripps didn't trust Ballard to take his own advice. Though Ballard had made several discreet inquiries about the Mironenko case in the following week, it was plain that his usual circle of contacts had been warned to keep their lips sealed. As it was, the next news about the case reached Ballard via the pages of the morning papers in an article about a body found in the house near the station on Kaiser Dam. At the time of reading, he had no way of knowing how the account tied up with Mironenko, but there was enough detail in the story to arouse his interest. For one, he had the suspicion that the house named in the article had been used by the service on occasion. For another, the article described how two unidentified men had almost been caught in the act of removing the body, further suggesting that this was no crime of passion. About noon, he went to see Cripps at his offices in the hope of coaxing him with some explanation, but Cripps was not available, nor would be, his secretary explained, until further notice. Matters arising had taken him back to Munich. Ballard left a message that he wished to speak with him when he returned. As he stepped into the cold air again, he realized that he'd gained an admirer, a thin-faced individual whose hair had retreated from his brow, leaving a ludicrous forelock at the high water mark. Ballard knew him in passing from Cripp's entourage, but couldn't put a name to the face. It was swiftly provided. Suckling, the man said. Of course, said Ballard. Hello. I think maybe we should talk if you have a moment, the man said. His voice was as pinched as his features, but Ballard wanted none of his gossip. He was about to refuse the offer when Suckling said, I suppose you heard what happened to Cripps. Ballard shook his head, Suckling delighted to possess this nugget, then said again, we should talk. They walked along the Kantstrasse towards the zoo. The street was busy with lunchtime pedestrians, but Ballard scarcely noticed them. The story that Suckling unfolded as they walked demanded his full and absolute attention. It was simply told. Cripps, it appeared, had made an arrangement to meet with Mironenko in order to make his own assessment of the Russians' integrity. The house in Schoenberg chosen for the meeting had been used on several previous occasions and had long been considered one of the safest locations in the city. It had not proved so the previous evening, however. KGB men had apparently followed Mironenko to the house and then attempted to break the party up. There was nobody to testify to what happened subsequently. Both the men who had accompanied Cripps, one of them Ballard's old colleague, Odell, were dead. Cripps himself was in a coma. And Mironenko? Ballard inquired. Suckling shrugged. They took him home to the motherland, presumably, he said. Ballard caught a whiff of deceit in the man. I'm touched that you're keeping me up to date, he said to Suckling. But why? You and Odell were friends, weren't you? Came the reply. With Cripps out of the picture, you don't have many of those left. Is that so? No offense intended, Suckling said hurriedly, but you've got a reputation as a maverick. Get to the point, said Ballard. There is no point, Suckling protested. I just thought you ought to know what had happened. I'm putting my neck on the line here. Nice try, said Ballard. He stopped walking. Suckling wandered on a pace or two before turning to find Ballard grinning at him. Who sent you? Nobody sent me, Suckling said. Clever to send the court gossip. I almost fell for it. You're very plausible. There wasn't enough fat on Suckling's face to hide the tick in his cheek. What do they suspect me of? Do they think I'm conniving with Mironenko? Is that it? No, I don't think they're that stupid. Suckling shook his head, like a doctor in the presence of some incurable disease. You like making enemies, he said. Occupational hazard. I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. I don't. There's changes in the air, Suckling said. I'd make sure you have your answers ready. Fuck the answers, Ballard said courteously. I think it's about time I worked out the right questions. Sending Suckling to sound him out smacked of desperation. They wanted inside information. But about what? Could they seriously believe he had some involvement with Mironenko, or worse, with the KGB itself? He let his resentment subside. It was stirring up too much mud, and he needed clear water if he was to find his way free of this confusion. In one regard, Suckling was perfectly correct. He did have enemies, and with Cripps indisposed, he was vulnerable. In such circumstances, there were two courses of action. He would return to London and there lie low, or wait around in Berlin to see what maneuver they tried next. He decided on the latter. The charm of hide-and-seek was rapidly wearing thin. As he turned north on Liebkneestrasse, he caught the reflection of a gray-coated man in a shop window. It was a glimpse no more, but he had the feeling that he knew the fellow's face. Had they put a watchdog onto him, he wondered? He turned and caught the man's eye, holding it. The suspect seemed embarrassed and looked away. A performance, perhaps, and then again, perhaps not. It mattered little, Ballard thought. Let them watch him all they liked. He was guiltless, if indeed there was such a condition this side of insanity. A strange happiness had found Sergei Mironenko, happiness that came without rhyme or reason and filled his heart up to overflowing. Only the previous day's circumstances had seemed unendurable. The aching in his hands and head and spine had steadily worsened, and was now accompanied by an itch so demanding he'd had to snip his nails to the flesh to prevent himself doing serious damage. His body, he had concluded, was in revolt against him. It was that thought which he had tried to explain to Ballard, that he was divided from himself and feared that he would soon be torn apart, but today the fear was gone. Not so the pains. They were, if anything, worse than they'd been yesterday. His sinews and ligaments ached as if they'd been exercised beyond the limits of their design. There were bruises at all his joints, where blood had broken its banks beneath the skin. But that sense of imminent rebellion had disappeared, to be replaced with a dreamy peacefulness. and at its heart, such happiness. When he tried to think back over recent events to work out what had cued his transformation, his memory played tricks. He had been called to meet with Ballard's superior. That he remembered. Whether he had gone to the meeting, he did not. The night was a blank. Ballard would know how things stood, he reasoned. He liked and trusted the Englishmen from the beginning, senses that, despite the many differences between them, they were more alike than not. If he let his instinct lead, he would find Ballard, of that he was certain. No doubt the Englishman would be surprised to see him, even angered at first. But when he told Ballard of his newfound happiness, surely his trespasses would be forgiven. A strange happiness had found Sergei Marinenko, happiness that came without rhyme or reason and filled his heart up to overflowing. Only the previous day's circumstance. Oops. That's not where I started. Ballard dined late and drank until later still in the Ring, a small transvestite bar which he had been first taken to by Odell almost 2 decades ago. No doubt his guide's intention had been to prove his sophistication by showing his raw colleague the decadence of Berlin, but Ballard, though he never felt any sexual frisson in the company of the Ring's clientele, had immediately felt at home here. His neutrality was respected. No attempts were made to solicit him. He was simply left to drink and watch the passing parade of genders. Coming here tonight raised the ghost of Odell, whose name would now be scrubbed from conversation because of his involvement with the Marinenko affair. Ballard had seen this process at work before. History did not forgive failure unless it was so profound as to achieve a kind of grandeur. For the Odells of the world, ambitious men who had found themselves, through little fault of their own, in a cul-de-sac from which all retreat was barred. For such men there would be no fine words spoken, nor medals struck. There would only be oblivion. It made him melancholy to think this, and he drank heavily to keep his thoughts mellow. But then, at 2 a.m, he stepped out onto the street. His depression was only marginally dulled. The good workers of Berlin were well abed. Tomorrow was another working day. Only the sound of traffic from the Kurfürstendamm offered sign of life somewhere near. He made his way towards it, his thoughts fleecy. Behind him, laughter. A young man, glamorously dressed as a starlet, tottered along the pavement arm in arm with his unsmiling escort. Ballard recognized the transvestite as a regular at the bar. The client, to judge by his sober suit, was an out-of-towner, slaking his thirst for boys dressed as girls behind his wife's back. Ballard picked up his pace. The young man's laughter, its musicality patently forced, set his teeth on edge. He heard somebody running nearby, caught a shadow moving out the corner of his eye. His watchdog, most likely. Though alcohol had blurred his instincts, he felt some anxiety surface, the root of which he couldn't fix. He walked on. Feather-light tremors ran in his scalp. A few yards on, he realized that the laughter from the street behind him had ceased. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see the boy and his customer embracing, but both had disappeared, slipped down one of the alleyways, no doubt to conclude their contract in darkness. Somewhere near, a dog had begun to bark wildly. Ballard turned round to look back the way he'd come, daring the desert street to display its secrets to him. Whatever was arousing the buzz in his head, the itch in his palms, it was no commonplace anxiety. There was something wrong with the street, despite its show of innocence. It hid terrors. The bright lights of the Kurfürstendamm were no more than 3 minutes' walk away, but he didn't want to turn his back on this mystery and take refuge there. Instead, he proceeded to walk back the way he'd come slowly. The dog had now ceased its alarm and settled into silence. He had only his footsteps for company. He reached the corner of the first alleyway and peered down it. No light burned at window or doorway. He could sense no living presence in the gloom. He crossed over the alley and walked on to the next. A luxurious stench had crept into the air, which became more lavish yet as he approached the corner. As he breathed in, the buzz in his head deepened to a threat of thunder. A single light flickered in the throat of the alley, a meager wash from an upper window. By it, he saw the body of the out-of-towner lying sprawled on the ground. He had been so traumatically mutilated, it seemed an attempt might have been made to turn him inside out. From the spilled innards, the ripe smell rose in all its complexity. Ballard had seen violent death before and thought himself indifferent to the spectacle, but something here in the alley threw his calm into disarray. He felt his limbs begin to shake, and then from beyond the throw of light, the voice spoke. "In God's name," he said. The voice had lost all pretension to femininity. It was a murmur of undisguised terror. Ballard took a step down the alley. Neither the boy nor the reason for his whispered prayer became visible till he had advanced 10 yards. The boy was half slumped against the wall amongst the refuse. His sequins and taffeta had been ripped from him. The body was pale and sexless. He seemed not to notice Ballard. His eyes were fixed on the deepest shadows. The shaking in Ballard's limbs worsened as he followed the boy's gaze. It was all he could do to prevent his teeth from chattering. Nevertheless, he continued his advance, not for the boy's sake. Heroism had little merit, he'd always been taught, but because he was curious, more than curious, eager to see what manner of man was capable of such casual violence. To look into the eyes of such ferocity seemed at the moment the most important thing in the world. Now the boy saw him and muttered a pitiful appeal, but Ballard scarcely heard it. He felt other eyes upon him, and their touch was like a blow. The din in his head took on a sickening rhythm, like the sound of helicopter rotors. In mere seconds, it mounted to a blinding roar. Ballard pressed his hands to his eyes and stumbled back against the wall, dimly aware that the killer was moving out of hiding. Refuse was overturned and making his escape. He felt something brush against him, and his eyes in time to glimpse the man shapen, his back crooked, his head too large. Ballard loosed a shout after him, but the berserker ran on, pausing only to look down at the body before racing towards the street. Ballard heaved himself off the wall and stood upright. The noise in his head was diminishing somewhat, and the attendant giddiness was passing. Behind him, the boy began sobbing. "Did you see?" he said. "Did you see?" "Who was it? Somebody you knew?" The boy stared at Ballard like a frightened doe, his mascaraed eyes huge. "Somebody?" he said. Ballard was about to repeat the question when there came a shriek of brakes, swiftly followed by the sound of an impact. Leaving the boy to pull his tattered trousseau about him, Ballard went back into the street. Voices were raised nearby. He hurried to their source. A large car was straddling the pavement, its headlights blazing. The driver was being helped from the seat, while his passengers, partygoers, to judge by their dress and drink-flushed faces, stood and debated furiously as to how the accident had happened. One of the women was talking about an animal on the road, but the other passengers corrected her. The body that lay in the gutter where it had been thrown was not that of an animal. Ballard had seen little of the killer in the alleyway, but he knew instinctively that this was he. There was no sign of the malformation he thought he'd glimpsed. However, just a man dressed in a suit that had seen better days, lying face down in a patch of blood. The police had already arrived, and an officer shouted to him to stand away from the body, but Ballard ignored the instruction and went to steal a look of the man's face. There was nothing there of the ferocity he had hoped so much to see, but there was much he had recognized nevertheless. The man was Odell. He told the officers that he had seen nothing of the accident, which was essentially true, and made his escape from the scene before events in the adjacent alley were discovered. It seemed every corner turned on his route back to his rooms brought a fresh question, chief amongst them, why he had been lied to about Odell's death, and what psychosis had seized the man that made him capable of the slaughter Ballard had witnessed. He would not get the answers to these questions from his sometime colleagues that he knew. The only man who might have beguiled to an answer from was Cripps. He remembered the debate they'd had about Mironenko and Cripps' talk of reasons for caution when dealing with the Russian. The glass eye had known then that there was something in the wind, though surely even he had not envisaged the scale of the present disaster. 2 highly valued agents murdered, Mironenko missing, presumed dead, he himself, if Suckling was to be believed, at death's door. And all this begun with Sergei Sakharovich Mironenko, the lost man of Berlin. It seemed his tragedy was infectious. Tomorrow, Ballard decided he would find Suckling and squeeze some answers from him. In the meantime, his head and his hands ached and he wanted sleep. Fatigue compromised sound judgment, and if he ever eluded that faculty, it was now. But despite his exhaustion, sleep eluded him for an hour or more, and when it came, it was no comfort. He dreamt whispers and hard among them, rising as if to drown them out the roar of the helicopters. Twice he surfaced from sleep with his head pounding. Twice a hunger to understand what the whispers were telling him drove him to the pillow again. When he woke for the 3rd time, the noise between his temples had become crippling, a thought-canceling assault which made him fear for his sanity. Barely able to see the room through the pain, he crawled from his bed. "Please," he murmured, as there were somebody to help him from his misery. A cool voice answered him from out of the darkness. "What do you want?" He didn't question the questioner, merely said, "Take the pain away." "You can do that for yourself," the voice told him. He leaned against the wall, nursing his splitting head, tears of agony coming and going. "I don't know how," he said. Your dreams give you pain, the voice replied, so you must forget them. Do you understand? Forget them and the pain will go. He understood the instruction, but not how to realize it. He had no powers of government in sleep. He was the object of these whispers, not they his. But the voice insisted. The dream means you harm, Ballard. You must bury it. Bury it deep. Bury it? Make an image of it, Ballard. Picture it in detail. He did as he was told. He imagined a burial party in a box, and in the box, his dream. He made them dig deep as the voice instructed him so that he would never be able to disinter this hurtful thing again. But even as he imagined the box lowered into the pit, he heard its boards creak. The dream would not lie down. It beat against confinement. The boards began to break. Quickly, the voice said. The din of the rotors had risen to a terrifying pitch. Blood had begun to pour from his nostrils. He tasted salt at the back of his throat. Finish it, the voice yelled above the tumult. Cover it up. Ballard looked into the grave. The box was thrashing from side to side. Cover it, damn you! He tried to make the burial party obey, tried to will them to pick up their shovels and bury the offending thing alive, but they would not. Instead, they gazed into the grave as he did and watched as the contents of the box fought for life. No, the voice demanded in fury mounting. You must not look. The box danced in the hole, the lid splintered. Briefly, Ballard glimpsed something shining up between the boards. It will kill you, the voice said. As if to prove its point, the volume of the sound rose beyond the point of endurance, washing out burial party box cell in a blaze of pain. Suddenly it seemed that what the voice said was true, that he was near to death, but it wasn't the dream that was conspiring to kill him, but the sentinel they had posted between him and it, the skull-splintering cacophony. Only now did he realize that he'd fallen on the floor, prostrate beneath this assault. Reaching out blindly, he found the wall and hauled himself toward it, the machine still thundering behind his eyes, the blood hot in his face. He stood as best he could and began to move towards the bathroom. Behind him, the voice, its tantrum controlled, began its exhortation afresh. It sounded so intimate that he looked round, fully expecting to see the speaker, and he was not disappointed. For a few flickering moments, he seemed to be standing in a small, windowless room, its walls painted a uniform white. The light here was bright and dead, and in the center of the room stood the face behind the voice, smiling. Your dreams give you pain, he said. This was the first commandment again. Bury them, Ballard, and the pain will pass. Ballard wept like a child. His scrutiny shamed him. He looked away from his tutor to bury his tears. Trust us, another voice said, close by. We're your friends. He didn't trust their fine words. The very pain they claimed to want to save him from was of their making. It was sick to beat him with if the dreams came calling. We want to help you, one or other of them said. No, he murmured. No, damn you. I don't believe. The room flickered out, and he was in the bedroom again, clinging to the wall like a climber to a cliff face. Before they could come for him with more words, more pain, he edged his way to the bathroom door and stumbled blindly towards the shower. There was a moment of panic while he located the taps, and then the water came on a rush. It was bitterly cold, but he put his head beneath it while the onslaught of rotor blades tried to shake the plates of his skull apart. Icy water trekked down his back, but he let the rain come down on him in a torrent, and by degrees the helicopters took their leave. He didn't move, though his body juddered with cold, until the last of them had gone. Then he sat on the edge of the bath, mopping water from his neck and face and body, and eventually, when his legs felt courageous enough, made his way back into the bedroom. He lay down on the same crumpled sheets in much the same position as he'd lain in before, yet nothing was the same. He didn't know what had changed him or how, but there he lay without sleep, disturbing his serenity through the remaining hours of the night, trying to puzzle it out, and little before dawn he remembered the words he had muttered in the face of the delusion. Simple words, but oh, their power. I don't believe, he said, and the commandments trembled. It was half an hour before noon when he arrived at the small book exporting firm which served Suckling for cover. He felt quick-witted despite the disturbance of the night and rapidly charmed his way past the receptionist and entered Suckling's office unannounced. When Suckling's eyes settled on his visitor, he started from his desk as if fired upon. Good morning, said Ballard. I thought it was time we talked. Suckling's eyes fled from the to the office door, which Ballard had left ajar. Sorry, is there a drought? Ballard closed the door gently. I want to see Cripps, he said. Suckling waded through the sea of books and manuscripts that threatened to engulf his desk. Are you out of your mind coming back here? Tell them I'm a friend of the family, Ballard offered. I can't believe you'd be so stupid. Just point me to Cripps and I'll be away. Suckling ignored him in favor of his tirade. It's taken 2 years to establish my credentials here. Ballard laughed. I'm going to report this, damn you. I think you should, said Ballard, turning up the volume. In the meanwhile, where's Cripps? Suckling, apparently convinced that he was faced with a lunatic, controlled his apoplexy. All right, he said, I'll have somebody call on you, take you to him. Not good enough, Ballard replied. He crossed to Suckling in 2 short strides and took hold of him by his lapel. He'd spent at most 3 years with Suckling in 10 years, but he'd scarcely passed a moment in his presence without itching to do what he was doing now. Knocking the man's hands away, he pushed Suckling against the book-lined wall. A stack of volumes, caught by Suckling's heel, toppled. Once more, Ballard said. The old man. Take your fucking hands off me, Suckling said, his fury redoubled at being touched. Again, said Ballard. Cripps. I'll have you carpeted for this. I'll have you out. Ballard leaned towards the reddening face and smiled. I'm out anyway. People have died, remember? London needs a sacrificial lamb, and I think I'm it. Suckling's face dropped. So I've nothing to lose, have I? There was no reply. Ballard pressed closer to Suckling, tightening his grip on the man. Have I? Suckling's courage failed him. Cripps is dead, he said. Ballard didn't release his hold. You said the same about Odell, he remarked. At the name, Suckling's eyes widened. And I saw him only last night, Ballard said, out on the town. You saw Odell? Oh, yes. Mention of the dead man brought the scene in the alleyway back to mind, the smell of the body, the boy's sobs. There were other faiths, thought Ballard, beyond the one he'd once shared with the creature beneath him, faiths whose devotions were made in heat and blood, whose dogmas were dreams. Where better to baptize himself into that new faith than here in the blood of the enemy? Somewhere at the very back of his head he could hear the helicopters, but he wouldn't let them take to the air. He was strong today, his head, his hands, all strong. When he drew his nails towards Suckling's eyes, the blood came easily. He had a sudden vision of the face beneath the flesh, of Suckling's features stripped to their essence. Sir? Ballard glanced over his shoulder. The receptionist was standing at the open door. Oh, I'm sorry, she said, preparing to withdraw. To judge by her blushes, she assumed this was a lover's tryst she'd walked in upon. Stay, said Suckling. Mr. Ballard was just leaving. Ballard released his prey. There would be other opportunities to have Suckling's life. I'll see you again, he said. Suckling drew a handkerchief from his top pocket and pressed it on his face. Depend upon it, he replied. Now they would come for him. He would have no doubt of that. He was a rogue element, and they would strive to silence him as quickly as possible. The thought did not distress him. Whatever they had tried to make him forget with their brainwashing was more ambitious than they had anticipated. However deeply they had taught him to bury it, it was digging its way back to the surface. He couldn't see it yet, but he knew it was near. More than once on his way back to his rooms, he imagined eyes at his back. Maybe he was still being tailed, but his instincts informed him otherwise. The presence he felt close by, so near that it was sometimes at his shoulder, was perhaps simply another part of him. He felt protected by it, as if by a local god. He had half expected there to be a reception committee awaiting him at his rooms, but there was nobody. Either Suckling had been obliged to delay his alarm call, or else the upper echelons were still debating their tactics. He pocketed those few keepsakes that he wanted to preserve from their calculating eyes and left the building again without anyone making a move to stop him. It felt good to be alive, despite the chill that rendered the grim streets grimmer still. He decided for no particular reason to go to the zoo, which, though he had been visiting the city for 2 decades, had never done. As he walked, it occurred to him that he'd never been as free as he was now, that he had shed mastery like an old coat. No wonder they feared him. They had good reason. Count Strauss was busy, but he cut his way through the pedestrians easily, almost as if they sensed a rare certainty in him and gave him a wide berth. As he approached the entrance to the zoo, however, somebody jostled him. He looked round to upbraid the fellow, but caught only the back of the man's head as he was submerged in the crowd heading on to Hardenbergstrasse. Suspecting an attempted theft, he checked his pockets to find a scrap of paper that had been slipped into one. He knew better than to examine it on the spot, but casually glanced round again to see if he recognized the courier. The man had already slipped away. He delayed his visit to the zoo and went instead to the Tiergarten, and there in the wilds of the great park found a place to read the message. It was from Mironenko, and it requested a meeting to talk on a matter of considerable urgency, naming a house in Marienfeld as a venue. Ballard memorized the details, then shredded the note. It was perfectly possible that the invitation was a trap, of course, set either by his own faction or by the opposition. Perhaps a way to test his allegiance or to manipulate him into a situation in which he could be easily dispatched. Despite such doubts, he had no choice but to go, however, in the hope that the blind date was indeed with Mironenko. Whatever dangers this rendezvous brought, they were not so new. Indeed, given his long-held doubts in the efficacy of sight, hadn't every date he'd ever made been, in some sense, blind? By early evening, the damp air was thickening towards a fog, and by the time he stepped off the bus on Hildburghauserstrasse, Hildburg Hauser-Strauss. There we go. It had a good hold in the city, lending the chill new powers to discomfort. Ballard went quickly through the quiet streets. He scarcely knew the district at all, but its proximity to the wall bled it of what little charm it might once have possessed. Many of the houses were unoccupied. Of those that were not, most were sealed off against the night and the cold and the lights that glared from the watchtowers. It was only with the aid of a map that he located the tiny street Mironenko's note had named. No lights burned in the house. Ballard knocked hard, but there was no answering footstep in the hall. He had anticipated several possible scenarios, but an absence of response at the house had not been amongst them. He knocked again and again. It was only then that he heard sounds from within, and finally the door was opened to him. The hallway was painted gray and brown and lit only by a bare bulb. The man silhouetted against the drab interior was not Mironenko. "Yes," he said. "What do you want?" His German was spoken with a distinct Muscovite inflection. "I'm looking for a friend of mine," Ballard said. The man, who was almost as broad as the doorway, he stood and shook his head. "There's nobody here," he said. "Only me. I was told you must have the wrong house." No sooner had the doorkeeper made the remark than noise interrupted from down the dreary hallway. Furniture was being overturned. Somebody had begun to shout. The Russian looked over his shoulder and went to slam the door into Ballard's face, but Ballard's foot was there to stop him. Taking advantage of the man's divided attention, Ballard put his shoulder to the door and pushed. He was in the hallway, indeed he was halfway down it, before the Russian took a step in pursuit. The sound of demolition had escalated and was now drowned out by the sound of a man squealing. Ballard followed the sound past the sovereignty of the lone bulb and into gloom at the back of the house. He might have well lost his way at that point, but that a door was flung open ahead of him. The room beyond had scarlet floorboards. They glistened as if freshly painted, and now the decorator appeared in person. His torso had been ripped open from neck to navel. He pressed his hands to the breached dam, but they were useless to stem the flood. His blood came in spurts, and with it his innards. He met Ballard's gaze, his eyes full to overflowing with death, but his body had not yet received the instruction to lie down and die. It juddered on in pitiful attempt to escape the scene of execution behind him. The spectacle had now brought Ballard to a halt, and the Russian from the door now took hold of him and pulled him back into the hallway, shouting into his face. The outburst in panicked Russian was beyond Ballard, but he needed no translation of the hands that encircled his throat. The Russian was half his weight again and had the grip of an expert strangler, but Ballard felt effortlessly the man's superior. He wrenched the attacker's hands from his neck and struck him across the face. It was a fortuitous blow. The Russian fell back against the staircase, his shout silenced. Ballard looked back towards the scarlet room. The dead man was gone, though scraps of flesh had been left on the threshold. From within, laughter. Ballard turned to the Russian. "What in God's name's going on?" he demanded, but the other man simply stared through the open door. Even as he spoke, the laughter stopped. A shadow moved across the blood-splattered wall of the interior, and a voice said, "Ballard?" There was a roughness there, as if the speaker had been shouting in all day and night, but it was the voice of Mironenko. "Don't stand out in the cold," he said. "Come on in, and bring Solimov." The other man made a bid for the front door, but Ballard had hold of him before he could take 2 steps. "There's nothing to be afraid of, comrade," said Mironenko. "The dog's gone." Despite the reassurance, Solomonov began to sob as Ballard pressed him towards the open door. Mironenko was right. It was warmer inside, and there was no sign of a dog. There was blood in abundance, however. The man Ballard had last seen teetering in the doorway had been dragged back into this abattoir while he and Solomonov had struggled. The body had been treated with astonishing barbarity. The head had been smashed open. The innards were a grim litter underfoot. Squatting in the shadowy corner of this terrible room, Mironenko. He had been mercilessly beaten to judge by the swelling of his head and upper torso, but his unshaven face bore a smile for his savior. "I knew you'd come," he said. His gaze fell upon Solomonov. "They followed me," he said. "They meant to kill me, I suppose. Is that what you intended, comrade?" Solomonov shook with fear, his eyes flitting from the bruised moon of Mironenko's face to the pieces of gut that lay everywhere about, finding nowhere a place of refuge. "What stopped them?" Ballard asked. Mironenko stood up. Even this slow movement caused Solomonov to flinch. "Tell Mr. Ballard," Mironenko prompted. "Tell him what's happened." Solomonov was too terrified to speak. "He's KGB, of course," Mironenko explained. "Both trusted men, but not trusted enough to be warned, poor idiots. So they were sent to murder me with just a gun and a prayer." He laughed at the thought, neither of which were much use in the circumstances. "I beg you," Solomonov murmured. "Let me go. I'll say nothing." You'll say what they want you to say, comrade, the way we all must, Mironenko replied. Isn't that right, Ballard? All slaves of our faith? Ballard watched Mironenko's face closely. There was a fullness there that could not be entirely explained by the bruising. The skin almost seemed to crawl. They have made us forgetful, Mironenko said. Of what? Ballard inquired. Of ourselves, came the reply, and with it Mironenko moved from his murky corner and into the light. What had Solomonov and his dead companion done to him? His flesh was a mass of tiny contusions, and there were bloody lumps at his neck and temples, which Ballard might have taken for bruises, but that they palpitated, as if something nested beneath the skin. Mironenko made no sign of discomfort, however, as he reached out to Solomonov. At his touch, the veiled assassin lost control of his bladder, but Mironenko's intentions were not murderous. With eerie tenderness, he stroked a tear from Solomonov's cheek. Go back to them, he advised the trembling man. Tell them what you've seen. Solomonov seemed scarcely to believe his ears, or at least suspected, as did Ballard, that this forgiveness was a sham, and that any attempt to leave would invite fatal consequences. But Mironenko pressed his point. Go on, he said. Leave us, please, or would you prefer to stay and eat? Solomonov took a single faltering step toward the door. When no blow came, he took a second step and a third, and now he was out the door and away. Tell them, Mironenko shouted after him. The front door slammed. Tell them what? Said Ballard. That I've remembered, Mironenko said, that I've found the skin they stole from me. For the first time since entering this house, Ballard began to feel queasy. It was not the blood nor the bones underfoot, but a look in Mironenko's eyes. He'd seen eyes as bright once before, but where? You, he said quietly, you did this. Certainly, Mironenko replied. How? Ballard said. There was a familiar thunder climbing from the back of his head. He tried to ignore it and pressed some explanation from the Russians. How, damn you? We are the same, Mironenko replied. I smell it in you. No, said Ballard. The clamor was rising. The doctrines are just words. It's not what we're taught, but what we know that matters, in our marrow, in our souls. He had talked of souls once before, of places of masters had built in which a man could be broken apart. At the time, Ballard had thought such talk mere extravagance. Now he wasn't so sure. What was the burial party all about, if not the subjugation of some secret part of him, the marrow part, the soul part? Before Ballard could find the words to express himself, Mironenko froze, his eyes gleaming more brightly than ever. They're outside, he said. Who are? The Russian shrugged. Does it matter, he said, your side or mine? Either one will silence us if they can. That much was true. We must be quick, he said, and headed for the hallway. The front door stood ajar. Mironenko was there in moments. Ballard followed. Together they slipped out into the street. The fog had thickened. It idled around the street lamps, muddying their light, making every doorway a hiding place. Ballard didn't wait to tempt the pursuers out into the open, but followed Mironenko, who was already well ahead, swift despite his bulk. Ballard had to pick up his pace to keep the man in sight. One moment he was visible, the next the fog closed around him. The residential property they moved through now gave way to more anonymous buildings, warehouses perhaps, whose walls stretched up into the murky darkness, unbroken by windows. Ballard called after him to slow his crippling pace. The Russian halted and turned back to Ballard, his outline wavering in the besieged light. Was it a trick of the fog, or had Mironenko's condition deteriorated in the minutes since they'd left the house? His face seemed to be seeping. The lumps in his neck had swelled further. We don't have to run, Ballard said. They're not following. They're always following, Mironenko replied. As if to give weight to the observation, Ballard heard fog-deadened footsteps in the nearby street. No time to debate, Mironenko murmured, and turning on his heel, he ran. In seconds, the fog had spirited him away again. Ballard hesitated another moment. Incautious as it was, he wanted to catch a glimpse of his pursuers as to know them for the future. But now, as the soft pad of Mironenko's step diminished into silence, he realized that the other footsteps had also ceased. Did they know he was waiting for them? He held his breath, but there was neither sound nor sign of them. The delinquent fog idled on. He seemed to be alone in it. Reluctantly, he gave up on waiting and went after the Russian at a run. A few yards on the road divided. There was no sign of Mironenko in either direction. Cursing his stupidity and lingering behind, Ballard followed the route in which was most heavily shrouded in fog. The street was short and ended at the wall lined with spikes, beyond which was there a park of some kind. The fog clung more tenaciously to the space of damp earth than it did to the street, and Ballard could see no more than 4 or 5 yards across the grass from where he stood. But he knew intuitively that he had chosen the right road, that Mironenko had scaled this wall and was waiting for him somewhere close by. Behind him, the fog kept its counsel. Either their pursuers had lost him or their way, or both. He hoisted himself up on the wall, avoiding the spikes by a whisper, and dropped down by the opposite side. The street had seemed pin-drop quiet, but clearly it wasn't, for it was quieter still inside the park. The fog was chillier here and pressed more insistently upon him as he advanced across the wet grass. The wall behind him, his only point of anchorage in this wasteland, became a ghost of itself, then faded entirely. Committed now, he walked out a few more steps, more certain than he was even taking a straight route. Suddenly the fog curtain was drawn aside, and he saw a figure waiting for him a few yards ahead. The bruises now twisted his face so badly, Ballard would not have known it to be Mironenko, but his eyes still burned on brightly. The man did not wait for Ballard, but turned again and locked off in solidity, leaving the Englishman to follow, cursing both the chase and the quarry. As he did so, he felt a movement close by. His senses were useless in the clammy embrace of fog and night, but he saw with his other eye, heard with that other ear, and he knew he was not alone. Had Mironenko given up the race and come back to escort him? He spoke the man's name, knowing that in doing so he made his position apparent to any and all, but equally certain that whoever stalked him already knew precisely where he stood. "Speak," he said. There was no reply out of the fog. Then movement. The fog curled upon itself, and Ballard glimpsed a form dividing the veils. "Mironenko!" He called after the man again, taking several steps through the murk in pursuit, and suddenly something was stepping out to meet him. He saw the phantom for a moment only, long enough to glimpse incandescent eyes and teeth grown so vast they wretched the mouth into a permanent grimace. Of those facts, eyes and teeth, he was certain. Of the other bizarrities, the bristling flesh, the monstrous limbs, he was less sure. Maybe his mind, exhausted with so much noise and pain, was finally losing its grip on the real world, inventing terrors to frighten him back into ignorance. "Damn you," he said, defying both the thunder that was coming to blind him again and the phantoms he would be blinded too. Almost as if to test his defiance, the fog ahead shimmered and parted, and something that he might have taken for human, but that had its belly to the ground, slunk into view and out. To his right he heard growls. To his left another indeterminate form came and went. He was surrounded, it seemed, by madmen and wild dogs. And Mironenko, where was he? Part of this assembly, or prey to it? Hearing a half word spoken behind him, he swung round to see the figure that was plausibly that of the Russian backing into the fog. This time he didn't walk in pursuit. He ran, and his speed was rewarded. The figure reappeared ahead of him, and Ballard stretched to snatch the man's jacket. His fingers found purchase, and all at once Mironenko was reeling round, a growl in his throat, and Ballard was staring into a face that almost made him cry out. His mouth was raw wound, his teeth vast, his eyes slits of molten gold. The lumps at his neck had swelled and spread, so that the Russian's head was no longer raised above his body, but part one of undivided energy, head becoming torso without an axis intervening. "Ballard," the beast smiled. Its voice clung to coherence with the greatest difficulty, but Ballard heard the remnants of Mironenko there. The more he scanned the simmering flesh, the more appalled he became. "Don't be afraid," Mironenko said. "What disease is this?" "The only disease I ever suffered was forgetfulness, and I'm cured of that." He grimaced as he spoke, as if each word was shaped in contradiction to the instincts of his throat. Ballard touched his hand to his head. Despite his revolt against the pain, the noise was rising and rising. "You remember too, don't you? You're the same." "No," Ballard muttered. Mironenko reached a spine-haired palm to touch him. "Don't be afraid," he said. "You're not alone. There are many of us, brothers and sisters." "I'm not your brother," Ballard said. The noise was bad, but the face of Mironenko was worse. Revolted, he turned his back on it, but the Russian only followed him. "Don't you taste freedom, Ballard, and life? Just a breath away." Ballard walked on, the blood beginning to creep from his nostrils. He let it come. "It only hurts for a while," Mironenko said. "Then the pain goes." Ballard kept his head down, eyes to the earth. Mironenko, seeing that he was making little impression, dropped behind. "They won't take you back," he said. "You've seen too much." The roar of helicopters did not entirely blot these words out. Ballard knew there was truth in them. His step faltered, and through the cacophony he heard Mironenko murmur, "Look." Ahead the fog had thinned somewhat, and the park wall was visible through rags of mist. Behind him Mironenko's voice had descended to a snarl. "Look at what you are." The rotors roared. Ballard's legs felt as though they would fold up beneath him, but he kept up his advance towards the wall. Within yards of it, Mironenko called after him again, but this time the words had fled altogether. There was only a low growl. Ballard could not resist looking just once. He glanced over his shoulder. Again the fog confounded him, but not entirely. For moments that were both an age and yet too brief, Ballard saw the thing that had been Mironenko in all its glory, and the sight of the rotors grew to screaming pitch. He clamped his hands in his face. As he did so, a shot rang out, then another, then a volley of shots. He fell to the ground as so much in weakness as in self-defense, and covered his eyes to see several human figures moving in the fog. Though he had forgotten their pursuers, they had not forgotten him. They traced into the park and stepped into the midst of his lunacy, and now men and half-men and things not men were lost in the fog, and there was bloody confusion on every side. He saw a gunman firing at a shadow, only to have an ally appear from the fog with a bullet in his belly. Saw a thing appear on 4 legs and flit from sight again on 2. Saw another run by carrying a human head in the air and laughing from its snouted face. The turmoil spilled towards him. Fearing for his life, he stood up and staggered back towards the wall. Cries and shouts and snarls went on. He expected either bullet or beast to find him with every step. But he reached the wall alive and attempted to scale it. His coordination had deserted him, however. He had no choice but to follow the wall along its length until he reached the gate. Behind him, the scenes of unmasking and transformation and mistaken identity went on. His enfeebled thoughts turned briefly to Mironenko. Would he or any of his tribe survive this massacre? Ballard, said a voice in the fog. He couldn't see the speaker, although he recognized the voice. He'd heard it in his delusion, and it had told him lies. He felt a pin prick at his neck. The man had come from behind and was pressing a needle into him. Sleep, the voice said, and with the words came oblivion. At first, he couldn't remember the man's name. His mind wandered like a lost child, although his interrogator would time and again demand his attention, speaking to him as though they were old friends. And there was indeed something familiar about his errant eye that went on its way so much more slowly than its companion. At last, the name came to him. You're Cripps, he said. Of course I'm Cripps, the man replied. Is your memory playing tricks? Don't concern yourself. I've given you some suppressants to keep you from losing your balance. Not that I think that's very likely. You fought the good fight, Ballard, in spite of considerable provocation. When I think of the way Odell snapped, he sighed. Do you remember last night at all? At first his mind's eye was blind, but then the memories began to come, vague forms moving in a fog. Park, he said at last. I only just got you out. God knows how many are dead. The other? The Russian? Mironenko? Cripps prompted. I don't know. I'm not in charge any longer, you see. I just stepped in to salvage something if I could. London will need us again sooner or later, especially now they know the Russians have a special corps like us. We heard rumors, of course, and then after you'd met with him, began to wonder about Mironenko. That's why I set up the meeting. And of course, when I saw him face to face, I knew there's something in the eyes, something hungry. I saw him change. Yes, it's quite a sight, isn't it? The power it unleashes. That's why we developed the program, you see, to harness that power, to have it work for us. But it's difficult to control. It took years of suppression therapy, slowly burying the desire for transformation, so that when we had left was a man with the beast faculties, a wolf in sheep's clothing. We thought we had the problem beaten, that if the belief systems didn't keep you subdued, the pain response would. But we were wrong. He stood up and crossed to the window. Now we have to start again. Suckling said you'd been wounded. No, merely demoted, ordered back to London. But you're not going. I will now that I've found you. He looked round at Ballard. You're my vindication, Ballard. You're living proof that my techniques are viable. You have full knowledge of your condition, yet the therapy holds the leash. He turned back to the window. Rain lashed the glass. Ballard could almost feel it upon his head, upon his back. Cool, sweet rain. For a blissful moment, he seemed to be running in it, close to the ground, and the air was full of the scents and downpour that released from the pavements. Mironenko said, Forget Mironenko, Cripps told him. He's dead. You're the last of the old order, Ballard, and the first of the new. Downstairs, a bell rang. Cripps peered out the window at the streets below. Well, well, he said. A delegation come to beg us return. I hope you're flattered. He went to the door. Stay here. We didn't show you off tonight. You're weary. Let them wait, eh? Let them sweat. He left the stale room, closing the door behind him. Ballard heard his footsteps on the stairs. The bell was being rung a second time. He got up and crossed to the window. The weariness of the late afternoon light matched his weariness. He and the city were still of one accord, despite the curse that was upon him. Below, a man emerged from the back of the car and crossed to the front door. Even at this acute angle, Ballard recognized Suckling. There were voices in the hallway, and with Suckling's appearance, the debate seemed to become more heated. Ballard went to the door and listened, but his drug-fueled mind could make little sense of the argument. He prayed that Cripps would keep to his word and not allow them to peer at him. He didn't want to be a beast like Mironenko. It wasn't freedom, was it, to be so terrible? It was merely a different kind of tyranny. But then he didn't want to be the first of Cripps' heroic new order either. He belonged to nobody, he realized, not even himself. He was hopelessly lost. And yet, hadn't Marinenko said at the first meeting that the man who did not believe himself lost was lost? Perhaps better to exist in the twilight between one state and another, to prosper as best he could by doubt and ambiguity, than to suffer the certainties of the tower. The debate below was gaining in momentum. Ballard opened the doors to hear better. It was Suckling's voice that met him. The tone was waspish, but no less threatening for that. "It's over," he was telling Cripps. "Don't you understand plain English?" Cripps made an attempt to protest, but Suckling cut him short. "Either you come in a gentlemanly fashion, or Gideon and Shepard carry you out. Which is it to be?" "What is this?" Cripps demanded. "You're nobody, Suckling. You're comic relief." "That was yesterday," the man replied. "There have been some changes made. Every dog has his day, isn't that right? You should know that better than anybody. I'd get a coat if I were you. It's raining." And there was a short silence. Then Cripps said, "All right, I'll come." "Good man," said Suckling sweetly. "Gideon, go check upstairs." "I'm alone," said Cripps. "I believe you," said Suckling. Then to Gideon, "Do it anyway." Ballard heard somebody move across the hallway, and then a sudden flurry of movement. Cripps was either making an escape bid or attacking Suckling, one of the two. Suckling shouted out, there was a scuffle, then cutting through the confusion, a single shot. Cripps cried out, then the sound of him falling. Now Suckling's voice thick with fury. "Stupid," he said, "stupid." Cripps groaned something which Ballard didn't catch. Had he asked to be dispatched, perhaps, for Suckling told him, "No, you're going back to London. Shepard, stop him bleeding. Gideon upstairs." Ballard backed away from the head of the stairs as Gideon began his ascent. He felt sluggish and inept. There was no way out of this trap. They would corner him and exterminate him. He was a beast, a mad dog in a maze. If only he'd killed Suckling, he'd had the strength to do so. But then, what good would that have done? The world was full of men like Suckling, men biding their time until they could show their true colors, vile, soft, secret men. And suddenly the beast seemed to move in Ballard, and he thought of the park and the fog and the smile on the face of Marinenko, and he felt a surge of grief for something he'd never had, the life of a monster. Gideon was almost at the top of the stairs. Though it could only delay the inevitable by moments, Ballard slipped through the landing and opened the first door he found. It was the bathroom. There was a bolt on the door, which he slipped into place. The sound of running water filled the room. A piece of guttering had broken and delivering a torrent of rainwater onto the windowsill. The sound and the chill of the bathroom brought the night of illusions back. He remembered the pain and blood, remembered the shower, water beating on his skull, cleansing him of the taming pain. At the thought, 4 words came to his lips, unbidden. "I do not believe." He had been heard. "There's somebody up here," Gideon called. The man approached the door and beat on it. "Open up!" Ballard heard him quite clearly, but didn't reply. His throat was burning. The roar of rotors was growling louder again. He put his back to the door and despaired. Suckling was up to the stairs and at the door in seconds. "Who's in there?" he demanded to know. "Answer me! Who's in there?" Getting no response, he ordered that Cripps be brought upstairs. There was more commotion as the order was obeyed. "For the last time," Suckling said. The pressure was building in Ballard's skull. This time it seemed the din had lethal intentions. His eyes ached as if about to be blown from their sockets. He caught sight of something in the mirror above the sink, something with gleaming eyes, and again the words came. "I do not believe." This time his throat, hot with other business, could barely pronounce them. "Ballard," said Suckling. There was triumph in the word. "My God, we've got Ballard as well. This is our lucky day." No, thought the man in the mirror. There was nobody of that name here. Nobody of that name at all, in fact, for weren't names the first act of faith, the first board in the box you buried freedom in? The thing he was becoming would not be named, nor boxed, nor buried, ever again. For a moment he lost sight of the bathroom and found himself hovering above the grave as they made him dig, and in the depths the box danced as its contents fought its premature burial. He could hear the wood splintering, or was it the sound of the door being broken down? The box lid flew off. A rain of nails fell on the heads of the burial party. The noise in his head, as if knowing that its tormentors had proved fruitless, suddenly fled, and with the delusion, he was back in the bathroom facing the open door. The men who stared through at him had the faces of fools, slack and stupefied with shock, seeing the way he was wrought, seeing the snout of him, the hair of him, the golden eye, the yellow tooth of him. Their horror elated him. "Kill it," said Suckling, and pushed Gideon into the breach. The man already had his gun from his pocket and was leveling it, but his trigger finger was too slow. The beast snatched his hand and pulped the flesh around the steel. Gideon screamed and stumbled away down the stairs, ignoring Suckling's shouts. As the beast raised his hand to sniff the blood on his palm, there was a flash of fire, and he felt the blow to his shoulder. Shepard had no chance to fire a second shot, however, before his prey threw the door upon him. Forsaking his gun, he made a futile bid for the stairs, but the beast's hand unsealed the back of his head in one easy stroke. The gunman toppled forward, the narrow landing filling with the smell of him. Forgetting his other enemies, the beast fell upon the off-fallen 8. somebody said. Ballard. The beast swallowed down the dead man's eyes in one gulp, like prime oysters. Again, those syllables. Ballard. He would have gone on with his meal, but the sound of weeping pricked his ears. Dead to himself he was, but not to grief. He picked the meal from his fingers and looked back along the landing. The man who was crying only wept from one eye. The other gazed on, oddly untouched. But the pain in the living eye was profound indeed. It was despair, the beast knew, which suffering was too close to him for the sweetness of transformation to have erased it entirely. The weeping man was locked in the arms of another man who had his gun placed against the side of his prisoner's head. If you make another move, the captor said, I'll blow his head off. Do you understand me? The beast wiped his mouth. Tell him, Cripps, he's your baby. Make him understand. The one-eyed man tried to speak, but the words defeated him. Blood from the wound in his abdomen seeped between his fingers. Neither of you need to die, the captor said. The beast didn't like the music of his voice. It was shrill and deceitful. London would much prefer to have you alive, so why don't you tell him, Cripps? Tell him I mean him no harm. The weeping man nodded. Ballard, he murmured. His voice was softer than the other. The beast listened. Tell me, Ballard, he said. How does it feel? The beast couldn't quite make sense of the question. Please tell me, for curiosity's sake. Damn you, said Suckling, pressing the gun into Cripps' flesh. This isn't a debating society. Is it good? Cripps asked, ignoring both man and gun. Shut up. Answer me, Ballard. How does it feel? As he stared into Cripps' despairing eyes, the meaning of the sounds he'd uttered became clear, the words falling into place like pieces of a mosaic. Is it good? The man was asking. Ballard heard laughter in his throat and found the syllables there to reply. Yes, he told the weeping man. Yes, it's good. He had not finished his reply before Cripps' hands sped to snatch at Suckling's. Whether he intended suicide or escape, nobody would ever know. The trigger finger twitched and the bullet flew up through Cripps' head and spread his despair across the ceiling. Suckling threw the body off and went to level the gun, but the beast was already upon him. Had he been more of a man, Ballard might have thought to make Suckling suffer, but he had no such perverse ambition. His only thought was to render the enemy extinct as efficiently as possible. 2 sharp and lethal blows did it. Once the man was dispatched, Ballard crossed over to where Cripps was lying. His glass eye had escaped destruction. He gazed on, fixedly untouched by the holocaust around them. Unseating it from the maimed head, Ballard put it in his pocket, and then he went out into the rain. It was dusk. He did not know which district of Berlin he'd been brought to, but his impulses, freed of reason, led him via the back streets and the shadows to a wasteland on the outskirts of the city, in the middle of which stood a solitary ruin. It was anybody's guess as to what the building might have once been, an abattoir, an opera house, but by some freak of fate it had escaped demolition, though every other building had been leveled for several hundred yards in each direction. As he made his way across the weed-clogged rubble, the wind changed direction by a few degrees and carried the scent of his tribe to him. There were many there, together in the shelter of the ruin. Some leaned their backs against the wall and shared a cigarette. Some were perfect wolves and haunted the darkness like ghosts with golden eyes, yet others might have passed for human entirely but for their tails. Though he feared that names would be forbidden amongst this clan, he asked 2 lovers who were rutting in the shelter of the wall if they knew of a man called Mironenko. The bitch had a smooth and hairless back and a dozen full teats hanging from her belly. Listen, she said. Ballard listened and heard somebody talking in a corner of the ruin. The voice ebbed and flowed. He followed the sound across the roofless interior to where a wolf was standing, surrounded by an attentive audience, an open book in its front paws. At Ballard's approach, 1 or 2 of the audience turned their luminous eyes up to him. The reader halted. Shh, the other one said. The comrade is reading to us. It was Mironenko who spoke. Ballard slipped into the ring of listeners beside him as the reader took up the story afresh. And God blessed them, and God said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. Ballard had heard the words before, but tonight they were new. And subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl in the air. He looked around the circle of listeners as the word described their familiar pattern, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. Somewhere near, a beast was crying. And that was... Sorry, I am 100% certain I've never read that, and that was really sad. And of course, Twilight at the Towers. Okay, that was what it was called.
Sorry, like I said, this is literally my first time reading that. I have never read that story before because I would definitely remember werewolves. It was really sad. Oh, werewolves. I'm probably going to get sad when we read Cabal too. Just. Also, this book is for real, officially mine. There's a tear in it now. The letters are so small, it's really difficult to read along the inside of the spine. So, and I was getting really, really into the story. So sorry. Yeah, this book is officially mine now. So, Twilight at the Towers. I've never read that before. I know I've already said it like 4 times, but that was really interesting. I like when he does monster stories. I love monster stories. I think everybody loves monster stories. Okay, so next week is The Last Illusion, which of course is Lord of Illusions. Luckily, I happen to just have one out. Which, cool fact, okay, so cool fact about Lord of Illusions is I actually got to speak to Simon Boswell. The link is under the Daily Grindhouse information on my link tree. It is not, we did not talk about Lord of Illusions specifically when we were talking about his new special release Santa Sangre soundtrack. But man, that guy is interesting as what. I highly recommend reading that. So anyway, next week we're reading The Last Illusion, Lord of Illusions. It is fun. I have read that. I might not cry. I don't know. Sorry. I have been kind of, yeah. That was sad. Oh man, this poor book. This poor thing. I'm gonna put it back where it belongs. I've been putting it in here, but I'm having to break that spine open every time I read a new story. I'm kind of thinking I might read Lord of Illusions from Cabal, just because I feel really awful destroying this book. So, thank you for reading with me. I will see y'all next week. Oh, and I'm super excited that it was about werewolves because I was wearing my full moon necklace, and also the full moon was on Monday. So, yay, werewolves and full moon time. I will see you next week. Bye.